It is common knowledge that Apple is regarded as a shining example of humble beginnings, a rags to riches story. And I don't think anything embodies that sentiment more perfectly than the very first computer that Apple ever made. Of course, I am talking about the Apple I, released back in 1976, primarily conceived by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. This is a machine that is retrospectively so modest in its design and grassroots in its spirit that its ongoing role in history does continue to reflect that. Given the multiple life-changing accomplishments Apple would achieve down the line, their very first product is sadly largely forgotten by comparison. Only around 200 of these computers were ever made. Of those, only about 20 of them are known to be fully working. And I am making this video because I had the privilege of seeing one. I was recently contacted by somebody who had verified access to a fully working Apple I, currently up for auction. And I even got to interview the specialist involved with the preservation of this particular machine.
I'm Corey Cohen, and I'm sort of the go-to guy for most of the museums and auction houses when it comes to early Apple technology, whether it's restoration, authentication, or they just need to, build an exhibit or some event. Apple was a successful company not because they had the best product. What they did was the genius of Wozniak in finding tricks to do things that were very expensive to do, that were good enough. So it changed how things were designed.
The entire experience was very inspiring in putting together this incredible story. Now, the scarcity and obscurity of the Apple I isn't much of a surprise. This computer was essentially the blueprint for Apple's flagship products, the reason their success story even exists. But when looking at the machine in its historical context, we start to see clearly why this was even possible in the first place. The Apple I's role as a pioneer in the personal computing era allowed for Apple to gain its footing in turning the computer, as we know it, into a lovable, relatable work of art.
Macintosh, the computer for the rest of us.
Are you ready to take on the mythological? To transcend our earthly boundaries and enter the Norse domains of Loki, Thor, Freyja, and Odin? Then this game will change everything. The Asgard Divide is one of the biggest events to date, and now is your chance to collect these 4 great champions of Norse mythology, all through in-game activities. Thor Feyhammer, the frontrunner of the storm, inflicts great damage to his enemies and harnesses the new thunder to unleash area of effect attacks. Odin Feyfather, Lord of the Mountain Hall of Asgard, can steal enemy buffs and revive allies. Freyja Fateweaver acts as Asgard's gold defender and can protect her allies with impenetrable shields. And Loki the Deceiver, the master of chaos and mischief, can dodge enemy attacks and guise himself under the perfect veil buff, whom you can receive for free simply logging in for 7 days between now and October 23rd. Players can also access the limited time event dungeon, where they can face their greatest enemies and truly test their capabilities.
This game is just like wizardry. With all this PvP, I can save all of mankind. This game is totally tubular.
Why miss out? Just scan or click the link below to get exclusive bonuses, including a huge starter pack with the Epic Champion Annex from the Undead Horses faction. And those who reach level 15 will get a starter pack with Epic Fame. Come join me on the other side with Raid Shadow Legends, the game that's hard to avoid and even harder to put down. Now, before we get into the history of the Apple I want to take a minute to admire both the similarities and differences this machine has to the computers that we take for granted today. As you can see here, we have our peripherals that have become the standard in today's space. We have the machine itself, along with a keyboard and a monitor. This type of setup was not unheard of at the time, but also not as common as you'd think. We'll get into why in a second, but in many respects, the Apple I was the machine that made this setup the standard in the PC community. Now notice the things that are different. There's no mouse, and the display is monochromatic, so if you wanted to display something like an image, it was literally made up of a bunch of computer characters rather than traditional pixels on a screen. So these were very low quality and, well, had no color. And if you wanted to load any kind of software that was more complex than the Apple I's machine code monitor, such as running BASIC, you had to load it onto a cassette, just as long as you had Apple's cassette interface card, which was an add-on for this machine. Then there's this feature, which is arguably my favorite, and also the most unique for its time. The Apple I board contained circuitry for both a video display and the keyboard interface. Again, I will explain what all of this means in just a minute, but in short, these were all very intentional design choices made by Apple, and provide a lot of historical context in what PCs were like back in the 1970s. So let's talk about that. The practicality and presence of computers really started to accelerate after World War II. They were no longer just concepts or extremely limited prototypes. They were now in office buildings, laboratories, government facilities, except these computers were very big, often the size of an entire living room. They were called mainframes, and businesses often had separate rooms just dedicated to storing them. By the late 1960s, mainframes became very common in the workspace, the most popular being IBM. These mainframes typically collected and transferred data on rolls of tape and printed outputs on things like paper or punch cards. This was great for documentation and record keeping, but it was also, what would you call it, a pain in the ass?
I am now telling the computer exactly what he can do with a lifetime supply of chocolate.
If you made just one mistake, because this was paper, you had to reprint everything all over again. And you didn't have keyboards, you basically had to push a bunch of buttons with lights, and there were often dozens of these on a huge mainframe. And you had to understand what all of them meant. It was hard, but scientists knew that computers weren't going to be large and hard forever. And this was because of something called Moore's Law, which basically states that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles approximately every 2 years. This means that computers would start to get smaller, and eventually could be small enough to fit on a desk, rather than be the desk. And during the 1970s, this was becoming a reality. You now had computers that were roughly the size of typewriters, and often resembled typewriters, but rather than just typing characters on a piece of paper, it was calculating commands and outputting sophisticated data on that paper. But since computers were getting smaller, there was ample opportunity to make them more flexible and agreeable to human interaction. Dare I say, personal. As we know, humans are inclined to make mistakes. What if we designed computers in a way where these mistakes are more reversible? Given that it's paper, a teletype's outputs are much more permanent. And the existence of these machines makes perfect sense. They come from the existence of typewriters. But you know what else was a familiar everyday object in the 1970s? A television. Unlike paper, whatever appeared on the screen was always changing, including text. So what if instead of printing on paper, a computer just printed on a screen? It's like a typewriter, but you can execute complex commands and even use a backspace when typing something. So the 1970s saw the rise of monitors and keyboards entering the computer realm. Very advanced early prototypes like the Xerox Alto did exist, but it was $32,000 in 1970s money. Moore's Law really helped make this more affordable and therefore much more commonplace as the years passed by. So at this time, the PC domain harbors a big culture on customizability. Buying pre-built computers at the store was not very common. The standard was to essentially build your own computers. You would buy the parts that you wanted individually and get something called an assembly kit to help you put them all together. The advantage here was that if you knew what you were doing, you could get exactly what you wanted out of your machine. But the disadvantage was you had to know what you were doing. These people were called hobbyists, and because of all these steps you had to take, the PC community had a bit of a barrier to entry. They were more user-friendly than mainframes, but by no means easy enough for the everyday person to understand it. So then the Apple I enters the picture, and 25-year-old Steve Wozniak of Menlo Park, California, is about to unintentionally make history. As he described it, this was a time where you had a bunch of cords running across your living room floor, hooked to your TV set and telephone, and you would just hope that your house wouldn't burn down. But hey, at least you got a computer out of it. This was an approach that definitely needed to be cleaned up. No pun intended. I say unintentionally make history because Woz didn't exactly have plans to become the head of a technological conglomerate. He just wanted to build his own personal computer. and a good one at that. He was working for HP at the time and was a member of the Homebrew Computer Club. He had particularly been inspired by the success of the Altair 8800, which had come out just a year prior in 1975, but he just didn't have the money to do it. All the processors that were on the market were quite expensive. That is until the release of the 6502 by MOS Technology. In the PC realm, this was quite the talk, as it was by far the cheapest processor on the market, and was most importantly, exactly what Woz needed. But he wanted to take his vision for a computer to the next level. His design would really focus on two things: ease of use and affordability. Not just with the processor, but also with how information was displayed. The Altair 8800 and just about all PCs at the time did not have built-in video capabilities. In other words, you couldn't just hook your computer up to the TV set willy-nilly. Instead, they had to be connected to something called a video terminal. These were basically TV monitors that had special video circuitry built into it so that the ASCII characters and other data from the computer could be interpreted and therefore show up on the screen. But these alone could be as much as $900 in the 1970s. Not only was it much more equipment to lug around, it was expensive. So when Woz was putting together his schematic, he decided to have this video display circuitry built into the board with the rest of the computer. Most people couldn't exactly afford a computer terminal, but they most definitely had a television. This computer already had the interpreter built into it. Now all the user needed was a screen. This worked best with composite video monitors, such as those used for security cameras at the time, but they were much cheaper in comparison. This was by far the biggest innovation in his design.
You have true engineers who would never think, I'm going to use a television as a screen. I'm going to use a monitor that's calibrated. And that's the attitude. That's why, HP, they had to show it to HP to get the sign off because Woz worked at HP. And they were like, yeah, we don't want this. It's not professional. It's a different attitude. You needed to have the spark of the different attitude.
When he was done, he took his schematic to HP, but they rejected it 5 times. But thankfully, he got a lot more praise when he shared it with the Homebrew Computer Club. One of the people there was none other than Woz's old friend, 21-year-old Steve Jobs. Woz was planning on sharing this schematic for free, essentially like an open source computer. But Jobs was like, no, we gotta sell this thing. Taking Moore's law into account, he knew that computers were only going to get smaller and more advanced as time went on. And with this product, they could potentially be the pioneers to something great that was right around the corner. If it wasn't them, it was just going to be someone else. So they might as well strike while the iron is hot. This was enough to convince a reluctant Wozniak who now felt that he really didn't have much to lose. So on April 1st, 1976, their company Apple Computer was founded. There were multiple reasons, many of which are even up to debate, for why the name Apple was chosen. For one, the name would alphabetically appear at the front of the phone book, even in front of Atari, where Jobs had been working at the time. Jobs was also a fruitarian, meaning he only ate fruit, and he particularly liked apples. In fact, he had just visited an apple orchard not too long beforehand. He also felt the name was just easy to remember and was lighthearted and not intimidating. He was also a big fan of the Beatles and was apparently partially inspired by their record company, Apple Corps. This would invite them into a ton of lawsuits in the upcoming decades. But alas, they were Apple, operating out of Jobs' living room.
The chips were put on by, in the beginning, Patty, Steve Jobs' sister. Many times she screwed up installing them. According to Dan Kotke, she was doing it while watching soap operas, and she would shove the chips in, I think she'd pay like $1 a board or something, and sometimes the legs would bend under. They spent some time troubleshooting it, but it wasn't generally Woz who was doing that. As Woz said, he was, by the time the Apple I was being produced at this point, he was thinking about the Apple II, and he was doing work at his apartment. So you could say they weren't really done in the garage, they were done in the living room. Jobs did make all of his phone calls at the house, just like in the movies. All that stuff is all, because who wants to sit in the garage and just pop chips in? You can sit on the couch and do it or in a chair.
Yeah. No. Wow.
Jobs sold his VW van, and Woz sold his HP 65 calculator, and they pooled together as much money as they could. But they didn't just have the processor and video terminal design to their advantage either. They took advantage of something rather underappreciated in the PC space at the time. This was a community that was very DIY-centric. You picked out the parts and built it all yourself, even down to the soldering. That's why assembly kits were such a big thing at the time. But again, this is difficult. Not everyone is going to know what they're doing and possibly blow something up. Jobs and Woz discovered that they could just outsource their parts and schematic to a company that would assemble and solder everything for them for just $13. So cheap to save them both time and headache putting these all together. With a cheap processor, innovative video design, and this new avenue of production, manufacturing these computers was not that expensive. This meant they could produce more of them and also sell them at a lower price than other PCs of the time while still making a profit. And so, being computer number one from the Apple Computer Company, they called it Apple Computer One. That was hard to figure out. Also known as Apple One for short, it was officially released in July of 1976 at a price of $666.66. A number a lot of people aren't too comfortable with. But Wozniak simply said that he liked the repeating digits and it was a third markup of $500, the money they were getting, because they also had to pay the retailer, the Byte Shop, for selling the machine in their stores. Not too long after, Apple One was garnering a reputation as an affordable, capable personal computer. With a whopping 8 kilobytes of RAM and built-in video support, computer magazines were praising the machine as one of the most assembled computers of its time. Obviously, with only 200 units built, it wasn't a smashing hit. But it was just good enough to get Apple's foot in the door and for a handful of people to see that they had something special here. People could now buy a computer without needing as much of the experience or all the extra expensive fancy stuff that typically came with it. All you needed was a keyboard, a monitor, and a power supply. And the machine itself was cheap in comparison to the other PCs on the market. The biggest hurdle really was just understanding the software. You see, the Apple One didn't have an operating system in the traditional sense. On its own, it ran something called a machine code monitor, where the user would basically just change memory locations and manipulate data at the low level. There wasn't a whole lot of personality to it. But for just $75, you could add on that Apple cassette interface that included a basic interpreter. All you had to do was hook a cassette player to the machine, place in a tape with BASIC installed on it, and when you pressed play, the computer would listen to the contents of the tape and turn it into computer data. What's happening here is that this tape contains audio frequencies that the computer interprets as binary, almost like Morse code on a telegraph, which the computer then interprets as BASIC, and you can now use the language on your computer. From here, you can now execute much more complex commands and even play games. It wasn't even that the Apple One had all these revolutionary features. It was just smart about it. In fact, the big selling point of Apple One's video integration wasn't even original either. Pre-existing computers like the Sol 20 and Sphere 1 had similar design, but the Sol 20 was much more expensive, and the Sphere 1, while similarly priced, couldn't run BASIC properly, which arguably was a huge part of its demise. The Apple One took on these features with a mission, a computer that was cheap and easy. It would ultimately be discontinued in September of 1977. Wozniak would literally answer all the customer support calls himself to help clients troubleshoot it. The Apple One wasn't perfect, but it was the stepping stone that gave Apple both the experience and the platform to work on perfecting this mission in this new era of the information age. This was something they would take with them when creating the Apple II, the machine that would essentially define an entire generation of PC users and accelerate Apple into becoming something neither Jobs nor Woz could have ever imagined. What are some fun facts or personal anecdotes that you have from growing up with Apple?
It's a good question. I still remember, you have me stumped. I went to a summer camp in Pennsylvania. And, you did like non-science things like dirt bike riding, camping, shooting guns, and things like that. But I remember writing this bubble sort, and I'm sure it was garbage code in BASIC. And I got to use the apples, and I was so excited. I remember just going, wow, Now I could go play like video games. They had pitch drives, they had color screens and stuff. Yeah, I think that's probably the best memory of it. Honestly, I didn't think about it. Right? It was just I had a computer. Luckily, my family could have. We could afford that stuff. So.
Although it's not exactly well known now, the Apple I has a comfortable place in history as the small domino that tipped and caused everything that came after it. It shows that no matter how great you become, the story often starts somewhere remarkably simple, especially if that's the intent to begin with. The Apple I walked so that Apple II could run. Literally. But you know what else Jobs and Woz did? Supported me on Patreon, of course. Patreon.com/NationSquid. They also bought me a coffee. Sure did.
Click my link or visit the QR code to enter a world of chaos and mythology.
A special thanks to my patrons and channel members for making this video possible. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you never miss a future video.